My son's wife looked me up and down the moment I walked through the door of the rehearsal dinner, then leaned over and whispered something to my son that made him laugh. I pretended not to notice. I'd gotten good at that over the years. 3 days later, at the reception, she found her moment. I'd waited until the toasts were done to hand my son the envelope. Plain white, sealed, my handwriting on the front. He opened it with one hand, champagne glass in the other, and when he saw what was inside, he passed it to her without a word. She held it up between 2 fingers like it was something she'd found on the floor of a bus station. Then she said, loud enough for the table to hear, "Is this a savings bond? Oh, honey, your mum sent us a savings bond." The laughter started small. Just the 2 of them, then his college friends at the end of the table. My son didn't laugh, but he didn't stop anyone else. I drove home alone at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night with the radio off and my hands steady on the wheel. When I got to my house, I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The porch light was on. I left it on out of habit, the way I had for 31 years, even now when there was nobody coming home. That night I opened a filing cabinet in my bedroom closet. It takes a specific key, one I keep on a chain with my mother's St. Christopher medal. I hadn't opened it in almost 2 years. Inside, in a red folder labeled simply with the year, were documents my son had never seen. A portfolio summary from my investment manager Charles at Meridian Wealth. 11 pages, single-spaced, updated quarterly. Real estate holdings, equity positions. The LLC documents for 3 commercial properties in the Nashville metro area, each one registered under my initials and my late husband's middle name. Net worth as of last October, $4.6 million. The savings bond was worth $50,000. I put the folder back, locked the cabinet, and went to bed. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in a long time. After Walter died and I went back to work full-time at 62, cleaning the offices at Vanderbilt's administrative building 3 nights a week, I learned to save tears for things that deserved them. A savings bond joke didn't deserve them. What my son's wife didn't know, what my son himself didn't know, was that I'd been building something since 1991. That was the year Walter and I bought our first rental property, a duplex on Nolensville Pike with a leaking roof and 1 tenant who paid cash on the 5th of every month, never a day earlier. We fixed the roof ourselves over a long weekend in October. Just the 2 of us. Walter on the ladder and me handing up shingles. 2 years later, we bought another one. Then another. Walter handled the maintenance. I handled the money. When he died in 2009, I kept going. I didn't know how to stop. The cleaning job wasn't about money. It was about structure. I needed somewhere to be at night. I needed a reason to get dressed and leave the house and be useful to something larger than my own grief. The people I worked with knew me as Alice, just Alice, the one who always brought coffee cake on Fridays, the one who'd been there longer than most of the supervisors. My son thought I was struggling. I let him think it because I wanted to see what he would do with that belief. What he did was marry a woman who laughed at my savings bond in front of 8 people, then smiled at me across the table as if nothing had happened. Her name was Whitney. 29 years old, marketing director at a regional hotel chain, perfectly put together in a way that suggested considerable effort. She called me by my first name the second time we met, without asking. She had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything, or at least from never having had to admit it. My son Colt was 34. He was good at his job, a project manager at a construction firm, genuinely good, the kind of good that comes from paying attention rather than from talent. He'd gotten that from Walter, What he hadn't gotten, or hadn't kept, was the ability to sit with discomfort without looking for a way out of it. The laugh at the rehearsal dinner, the silence at the reception table. Those weren't cruelty. They were the path of least resistance, the same path he'd been taking for 3 years. I want to be precise about what I knew and when I knew it, because this story isn't about revenge, even if that's what it looks like from the outside. 6 weeks before the wedding, my daughter-in-law's father called me. His name is Dwight, and he is a perfectly decent man who has the misfortune of having raised his daughter to believe that discomfort is someone else's fault. He called to tell me, apologetically, that the venue for the rehearsal dinner had changed. The new location was Harborview Event Center in downtown Nashville, a converted warehouse space that rented for $6,000 on weekends. He said Whitney had chosen it. He said he hoped I wouldn't mind the drive. I told him it was no trouble. After we hung up, I looked up Harborview Event Center in my property records. I owned it. Not personally. Through Nolensville Commercial Holdings, LLC, which was one of 3 commercial LLCs I'd organized over the past 12 years. I'd bought the building in 2017 when the previous owner, a restaurant group, couldn't make the payments. I'd spent 14 months renovating it, then leased it to an event management company that ran it as a venue. They had handled the bookings ever since. My property manager, a methodical man named Roger, sent me monthly reports. I read them, signed what needed signing, and didn't involve myself in the day-to-day. Whitney had booked the rehearsal dinner at a venue her mother-in-law owned, and she had no idea. I sat with that information for several days. I didn't tell anyone. Then came the reception. Then came the savings bond held up between 2 fingers. Then came the laughter. That night in my driveway, I made a decision. The Monday after the wedding, I called Charles at Meridian Wealth. We talked for 40 minutes. I told him I wanted to restructure the trust I'd set up for Colt. He asked what changes I had in mind. I told him the principle would remain intact, but I wanted to add conditions for distribution, meaningful conditions, the kind that required demonstrated judgment over time, not just age. Charles was quiet for a moment. He'd known me for 16 years. He understood what I wasn't saying. He said he'd have documents ready by Thursday. I also called Roger. I asked him to pull all future bookings under the Whitmore name from Harborview. There was no Whitmore booking after the rehearsal dinner, but there would have been. Whitney had mentioned at dinner to the table rather than to me that she and Colt planned to host their 1-year anniversary celebration there. It was, she said, a beautiful space. Roger pulled the name from the preferred client list and flagged any future inquiries for my review. That was all I did that week. I went to work on Tuesday night, cleaned 7 floors of administrative offices, ate my break in the little room on the basement level where we kept the folding chairs and the extra paper towels, and listened to the radio for 15 minutes before going back upstairs. The question started about 3 weeks later. Colt called on a Sunday afternoon. I let it ring. He left a voicemail that started normally enough. "How are you, Mum? We've been meaning to call," and then shifted halfway through into something else. Whitney had been trying to make a new booking at Harborview, and the event company said her account had been flagged for review. Did I know anything about that? He asked it casually, the way you ask something you're not entirely sure you want answered. I didn't call back that day, or the next. His second voicemail was shorter. "Something's going on with our booking, Mum. Can you just call me?" His third was Whitney's voice. I could tell she'd taken the phone. She said she didn't know if there was some kind of misunderstanding, but they'd been planning this anniversary event, and it seemed like there was an issue with the venue, and she just wanted to clear it up. Her voice was even, professional, the voice she used at work. I listened to all 3 voicemails sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I'd let go cold. Outside the window, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the hedge. The refrigerator hummed. I'd lived in this house for 31 years, and I knew every sound it made. There was something else going on. I'd found out about it not from a private investigator, but from Charles, almost by accident. He'd called to go over the trust documents and mentioned while we were talking that a contact of his at a regional lender had raised a question. Colt's name had come up in a credit inquiry that seemed inconsistent with his income. Charles, who was careful about everything, said he didn't want to speculate, and I shouldn't either. But he thought I should know. I made one phone call to a woman I'd known for 20 years named Patricia Oakes, who was a certified financial planner and who had, before she retired, spent 12 years doing fraud examination for a large accounting firm. I didn't ask her to investigate anything. I asked her to look at what was publicly available and tell me if she saw anything that concerned her. She called back in 4 days. Colt had taken out a personal loan 14 months ago for $85,000. The collateral he'd listed included assets he didn't own. The loan was through a private lender, not a bank. The terms were not standard. Patricia said she couldn't tell me exactly what it had been used for, but the lender's name was not one she recognized as legitimate, and the repayment structure was the kind that got people in serious trouble if income fluctuated. She said, "Alice, your son is in financial trouble he doesn't know how to get out of." I asked whether Whitney knew. Patricia said in her experience, when one spouse is doing something like this, the other one usually has a sense that something is wrong, even if they don't know the specifics. I sat with that for a long time. Here is what I thought about, alone in my kitchen on a Wednesday evening. I thought about the duplex on Nolensville Pike in 1991. I thought about Walter on the ladder and me handing up shingles in October cold. I thought about the night Colt was born, 34 years ago. Walter pacing the hospital hallway in the same boots he'd worn all week on a job site, because we'd been in a hurry and he hadn't had time to change. I thought about every birthday I'd worked overtime beforehand to afford, every tuition bill I'd paid in full before it was due, and I thought about a savings bond held up between 2 fingers and the laughter that followed. Then I picked up the phone and called my son. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. "Mom." "Hey?" "I need you and Whitney to come to Harborview next Saturday," I said. 2 o'clock. "Why Harborview?" "Because I have something to show you, both of you." He was quiet for a moment. "Is this about the booking issue?" "It's about several things. Come at 2, Colt." He said he would. He sounded relieved and uncertain at the same time, which was the same expression he'd had as a child when he knew he'd done something wrong, but wasn't sure yet what the consequence would be. That week I also called the regional lender, whose name Patricia had flagged. I did not identify myself as anything other than an investor with a question about standard terms. The conversation lasted 8 minutes and confirmed what Patricia had suggested. The lender operated in a legal grey area. The loan my son had taken out had a balloon payment clause that would come due in 7 months. If he missed it, the consequences were severe. I called Charles back. I told him to prepare a separate document alongside the trust restructuring. I would explain when I saw him. Saturday came with the kind of October light that makes Nashville look like a painting. I arrived at Harborview at 1:30. Roger met me at the side entrance. We walked through the building together, the big open event space with its exposed beams and restored brick, smaller rooms along the east wall. The kitchen I'd had professionally upgraded 2 years after the renovation. It was a good building. I was proud of it in a quiet, private way that had nothing to do with who knew I owned it. At 1:50, a car pulled into the lot. Colt driving, Whitney in the passenger seat. She got out first, in a blazer and jeans, sunglasses pushed up on her head, looking around at the building with the mild curiosity of someone who'd been here before and found it familiar. Colt came around the car and put his hand at her back, and they walked toward me together. "Mom," he hugged me. Whitney smiled, the careful smile she used when she wasn't sure what was expected. "Thank you both for coming," I said. "Of course, what's this about?" Whitney's voice was pleasant, measured. "Let's go inside." We sat at one of the round tables in the main event space, the same room where Colt and Whitney had hosted their rehearsal dinner 4 weeks earlier. The same brick walls, the same high windows, the same light dropping in long rectangles across the hardwood floor. I'd brought a folder. I set it on the table but didn't open it yet. "I want to ask you something first," I said to Whitney. She looked at me steadily. "At the rehearsal dinner, when you showed everyone the envelope I brought, did you mean for it to be funny?" Her expression shifted slightly. Did you mean for it to be funny?" She looked at Colt. He looked at the table. "I think it came across poorly," she said finally. "It did. I kept my voice even. I've been working nights for 6 years, not because I need the income, because I wanted to keep being useful, because I didn't want to stop. The people I work with don't know what I've built. My son doesn't know what I've built. I kept it that way for a reason." I opened the folder and slid the first document across the table. It was the portfolio summary from Charles. 11 pages, 4.6 million, current as of last week. Whitney picked it up. I watched her read the first page, watched the color shift in her face, watched her set it down and look at me. Colt took it from her. He read for a long moment without speaking. When he looked up, his eyes were different. Not just surprised, something deeper, something closer to grief. "Mom, I bought my first rental property the year you were born," I said. "Your dad and I did it together. After he died, I kept going. 3 commercial properties now, 11 residential units, the portfolio Charles manages, and this building." Whitney went still. "This building," I said, "is one of mine. Has been since 2017. I own it through an LLC. Your rehearsal dinner was held in a building I own. The silence in that room was the kind that has weight." Whitney set the portfolio summary down on the table very carefully. She said nothing. Colt said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted to see who you'd both become without my money shaping you. I wanted to know what you valued." His jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's honest." Whitney looked at Colt, then back at me. Her composure was intact, but only just. "I need to understand what you're telling us. Are you saying you're cutting us off? Is this—" "I'm not cutting anyone off." I pushed the second document across the table. "This is a restructured trust. Colt is the beneficiary. The principal is untouched. But there are conditions now. Distribution requires demonstrated financial responsibility, meaning no undisclosed debt, no instruments with non-standard terms, no assets misrepresented as collateral." The silence that followed was a different kind. Whitney said very quietly, "How did you know about the loan?" "I didn't answer that directly. I know the terms," I said. "I know the balloon payment schedule. I know what happens in 7 months if it isn't resolved. And I know that the savings bond you held up in front of 8 people at my son's reception dinner was worth $50,000, which is more than half what Colt borrowed from a lender who should not have that kind of hold over my son." Colt put his face in his hands. "I didn't plan to humiliate you," I said. "I wasn't trying to. I asked you here because I am your mother, and I am not going to watch you drown because you were too proud to ask for help and too proud to admit when something had gone wrong. But I am also not going to pretend that the last several weeks didn't happen. They did happen. Whitney stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot for a long moment. Her shoulders were tight. When she turned around, something in her face had changed. The composure was gone, and what was underneath it was younger and more frightened than anything I'd seen from her. "I was embarrassed," she said. "By you. I was embarrassed, and I shouldn't have been." She sat back down. Colt looked at his wife, then at me. He said, "I didn't know about all of this. Any of it. You spent 30 years and I didn't know." "You didn't ask." "I know." We sat there for a few minutes with that between us. Then I told them what I wanted to do. Not punishment, not a lesson delivered from a height. The loan my son had taken out could be paid off cleanly through a direct transfer from one of my accounts, structured as an advance against the trust under terms Charles had already drafted. The lender would be paid out in full. The arrangement with the non-standard lender would be severed. In exchange, Colt would work with a financial advisor, someone Charles recommended, on a 12-month plan. Monthly check-ins. Transparent accounting. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted him to build the habit of knowing where he stood. He said yes immediately. Whitney said, "I owe you an apology." "You do," I said, "and I'll accept it. But what I'd rather have is accountability. From both of you. Not to me. To yourselves." She nodded. She looked like someone who had just sat down after a very long time standing. "There was one more thing. I'd been thinking about it for a month. The building we were sitting in," I said, "is profitable. It's been well managed. But I've been thinking about what I want it to be for. I'm 67. I'm not going to manage commercial properties forever. I've been in conversation with a non-profit that runs workforce housing programs in 3 counties. They need a community hub, a space for job training, financial literacy classes, childcare resources. Harborview would work well for that." Colt was quiet. Then he said, "You're going to give it away." "I'm going to repurpose it. There's a difference. I've been giving away money quietly for years. Scholarships, 2 of them, at the high school I went to in Murfreesboro. A contribution to the free clinic on Dickerson Pike every year since 2014. But this feels different. This building hosted the rehearsal dinner for a wedding where someone made me feel small. I'd like it to become a place where people feel capable instead." Whitney looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I help with the transition?" I looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because I think I owe someone something," she said. "Not you necessarily, but someone." We stayed in the building for another hour. I showed them the kitchen, the smaller rooms that could be converted to classrooms, the courtyard out back that had never been fully used. Colt asked questions about the renovation, about the original purchase. He asked about other buildings. He asked about the duplex on Nolansville Pike. He asked about Walter. We ended up standing in the courtyard in the October afternoon, the 3 of us, not quite comfortable and not quite easy, but something closer to honest than we'd been in 3 years. Before we left, Colt hugged me for a long time without saying anything. I let him. I didn't say it was all right because it wasn't entirely, not yet. But I held on. Whitney shook my hand at her car door, which was formal and strange and somehow right. She said, "I'd like to start over if that's possible." I told her possible was a good word. It left room. That was 6 months ago. The non-profit Community Forward Nashville took possession of Harborview in February, after a transition that took 3 months and more paperwork than I'd anticipated. The event management company was bought out cleanly. The renovation plans are underway. The first workforce training cohort starts in the spring. 22 people, mostly women between 40 and 60, learning bookkeeping, property management basics, small business licensing. The instructor for the property management module asked me if I would come speak to the group. I said I would. Colt's loan was paid off in December. He met with Charles's recommended advisor twice before Christmas and has another meeting next week. He called me after the first one to tell me he hadn't understood half of what was in his own financial picture until someone sat down and explained it plainly. He said that as if it were a revelation. I told him it was a start. Whitney has been at 3 of the Harborview planning meetings. She is good in a room. She knows how to move the conversation forward, and she does not waste time on consensus for its own sake. I watched her at the second meeting redirect a disagreement between 2 board members in about 90 seconds, and I thought, she's wasted in hotel marketing. I didn't tell her that, but I thought it. Last month I was working my Tuesday night shift building 4, 3rd floor, the long row of cubicles that belongs to the provost's office. My co-worker May was on the other end of the floor, and we had the radio going low in the background, an oldie station out of Brentwood. Somewhere around midnight, May called down the hallway and asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. We sat in the break room for 15 minutes, May and I, drinking coffee out of paper cups, talking about her granddaughter's school play and whether the night shift supervisor was going to retire before the end of the year. The fluorescent light above us flickered once and held. The building was quiet around us. I thought about the rehearsal dinner, about the savings bond held up between 2 fingers, about the laughter. Then I thought about the courtyard at Harborview, about 22 women starting a class in the spring, about a son who was learning to stand on his own ground, about a daughter-in-law who showed up to a planning meeting she didn't have to attend and stayed 2 hours past the end. I finished my coffee, I rinsed the cup. I went back to work. There's a kind of wealth that doesn't appear in any portfolio. It doesn't have a line item. Charles can't track it in a quarterly report. It's the thing that gets built in the years when nobody is watching, in the duplex with the leaking roof, in the break room at midnight, in the courtyard in October, when you're standing with someone who hurt you and trying to figure out if trust can be rebuilt from scratch. It can. I know it can because I've been building things from scratch my whole life, and nothing I've ever built started out looking like what it became. I fought a lot about what caused all of it, not just Whitney holding that envelope up like it was something to laugh at, but the years before that. The slow drift, the way Colt had learned to smooth things over instead of standing in them, the way I had let silence do the work that honesty should have done. None of it happened in a single moment. It accumulated the way debt does, quietly, in the dark, until one day the balance comes due. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell stories like mine. They talk about the revelation, the filing cabinet, the portfolio, the building. They want the moment the table goes quiet, but the revelation wasn't what mattered. What mattered was everything that made it necessary. I had built something real over 30 years, not just financially, though that was real too, the duplex with the leaking roof, the properties, the portfolio Charles managed so carefully. What I had built was a way of living that didn't depend on anyone else's opinion of my worth. I had done that through work that most people would have walked away from. Night shifts at 62, a mop and a bucket and a radio station out of Brentwood. Every dollar I didn't spend was a choice I was making about what I actually valued versus what I was supposed to value. That kind of discipline, the quiet, unsexy kind, is what I'd call the backbone of character. Not a rule you follow, a standard you hold yourself to when nobody's watching and there's no reward for it. But I had also made mistakes that required the same honesty. I had let my son grow up without knowing what I had built, which meant he grew up without the full picture of what hard work could produce. I told myself I was testing his character. Maybe I was, but I was also protecting myself from the vulnerability of being known. And because I kept the secret too long, Colt made choices from incomplete information. He borrowed money he shouldn't have borrowed from people he shouldn't have trusted, because he didn't know he had a safety net, and because no one had ever sat down with him and explained, plainly, how money worked and what it cost to live without thinking carefully. That's on me. I've accepted that. What changed things wasn't the confrontation at Harborview. It was what happened after it. Colt sitting with a financial advisor, asking questions he'd never thought to ask. Whitney showing up to a planning meeting for a building she'd once booked without knowing who owned it, staying 2 hours past the end because the work mattered to her. Those weren't performances. They were people deciding, slowly, to become more honest versions of themselves. That kind of growth isn't dramatic. It doesn't make for a good story. But it's the only kind that holds. I think about the 22 women starting the workforce training program in the spring. Most of them have been building something too, in circumstances harder than mine. They've been doing it without the language for it, without anyone showing them that what they're doing has a name and a method and a future. That's what I want Harborview to give them. Not charity. Clarity. My mother used to say that you find out who people are in the middle, not at the beginning or the end. Not when things are new and hopeful, and not when they're resolved and clean, but in the middle, when it's hard and uncertain and the outcome isn't clear yet. That's where I found my son again. That's where Whitney surprised me. And that, if I'm being honest, is where I found myself too. Not in the filing cabinet, not in the portfolio summary, but in the choice I made about what to do with what I had built once I finally let someone else see it.